Welcome to tonight's presentation, The Power of Birds, Putting the Kibosh on Extinction. I am Sarah Norman, the Community Engagement Manager for Landmark Conservancy, and we are thrilled to have Craig Thompson with us tonight. I know that we have some people on the call that are new to Landmark Conservancy, and so I'd like to introduce our organization to you. Landmark Conservancy is a 501c3 nonprofit conservation organization. We are a land trust, and our core work is to permanently protect land in Northwest Wisconsin. We have a 20-county service area, and our map, which we call our dot map of our projects, is up on the screen here. We have a headquarters in Menominee, Wisconsin, and an office up in Bayfield as well. To date, Landmark has permanently protected over 41,000 acres, and this includes over 220 conservation easements, 100 projects that provide public access, and Landmark owns and manages 24 nature preserves. So it's my pleasure to introduce Craig Thompson, our guest speaker for tonight. Craig is a knowledgeable and incredibly passionate conservationist and birder. He is a longtime employee of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and he currently serves as the Chief of Program Integration for the Natural Heritage Conservation Program. Craig has been featured on PBS. He has led over 25 international birding trips, and his passion for birds and conservation is simply contagious. One of the things that I appreciate most about him is his enthusiasm, and he really does make birding and learning about birds fun. So I'm excited for all of us to learn from him tonight. And without further ado, please welcome Craig Thompson.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it. I just want to make sure, can everyone see me and hear me okay as we're getting started? All right. So thanks again, Sarah, for the opportunity to speak to everyone tonight. And I want to also thank Zariah Whitaker for pulling all the levers behind the scenes to actually make this happen. Without these two working on all the facets of providing this presentation, it simply wouldn't have happened. So thanks again to both of you. Very excited to be here tonight to speak to everyone about, as Sarah indicated, two of my favorite topics. The first, of course, is birds. And the second is conservation, and having the opportunity to meld both of them into a single presentation just makes me giddy with excitement. So what I want to talk specifically about, however, is the extinction crisis. So I'm going to go over what we're dealing with in terms of this significant existential threat. Talk about how birds actually provide a venue for effectively addressing extinction, not only here in Wisconsin, but globally as well. Provide a couple of really fascinating examples of how that happens. We'll take a look at Landmark's work, the important things that they're doing protection-wise, and how that all contributes to a greater whole in terms of mobilizing an army of conservationists to help stem the loss of species globally. And then finally, I want to look at the things that, examine briefly, the things that you as citizens and landowners and members of Landmark can do to help fight the extinction crisis. So with that, we'll get started. So there's little doubt that the extinction crisis poses an existential threat to all of us. And it's something, along with climate change, that is really quite daunting. Now, if we look at what's coming out in the media, what we hear predominantly is all kinds of discussion, ringing all kinds of alarm bells as it relates to climate change. All of that is appropriate. My concern is what we hear to a lesser degree, in fact, a far lesser degree, is about the extinction crisis that also poses an existential threat to civilization. The reason I'm concerned is because these two crises are two sides of the same coin, and we have to deal with them simultaneously. So yes, let's address climate change, but at the same time, we need to really understand the facets of the extinction crisis, how significant it truly is, and then undertake comprehensive strategies in order to address it. And that's where the birds come in. So just a little background on what's happening in terms of species loss across the planet. You may or may not have heard of the insect apocalypse, but what we're looking at is a situation where insects are quite simply far less abundant globally than they used to be. I remember years ago when my family, we'd jump in the car and we'd drive anywhere through the country. And when we would end our trip, I could go out to the front of the car and literally peer through the grill of my dad's old Rambler and just see an astonishing assortment of insects that had been unfortunately killed on the grill, and the windshields were covered with bugs. That doesn't happen anymore. Rarely is there a situation where somebody's driving somewhere and they're covered with bugs when they end up at their destination. And that's reflective of the level of change we're seeing. So we're not only seeing diminishment of certain species, but a decrease in the abundance of insects everywhere. That's of great concern, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. This, by the way, is the pine hoverfly. This happens to be the most rare insect left in England. So England's getting a pretty good Britain is getting a good handle on what's going on in terms of the loss of insects, and this poor little bug is teetering right on the brink. And we're seeing species loss across all taxa, that is, across all groups of organisms. So we know we're seeing significant declines in amphibians and reptiles as well. And in many instances, those declines come with immediate implications for us, as is the case with the decline of frogs throughout Central America. We're looking at an actual malaria outbreak related to the loss of frogs, and the frogs simply aren't eating the mosquitoes, and their larvae, the tadpoles, aren't eating the mosquito larvae. And so what we have is a mosquito outbreak. So these chain reactions and these domino effects are beginning to become more evident as we continue to lose species. By the way, this splendid looking frog, the Panamanian golden frog, used to be quite common in the cloud forests up in the mountains of far western Panama. It has disappeared completely from its natural haunts and now is found only in aquariums, in collections where they're trying to keep this species bred in captivity with the hope of eventually being able to reintroduce it to the wild. We know, as we're looking across, again, all of the groups of species, that large mammals globally have declined 70%, and those declines have been particularly acute for groups of species like the elephants, the large mammals in Africa, primates worldwide, and so on. And so as we lose these species, as they become less abundant, our systems, our ecosystems that are dependent on species for survival, quite literally, their function depends on the ability of species to interact. As we lose species, the ability of our ecosystems to maintain function that provides clean water and clean air and so on for us becomes ever more precarious. What we know when we look at birds is that birds are sadly disappearing. And the question is, well, how do we know this? Well, every year since 1966, biologists have been fanning out across North America, undertaking what they call a breeding bird survey. And that has occurred from Canada down through the southern United States. And it's along the same routes, counting the same birds, using the same protocols year after year. The data that has been generated as a result of these breeding bird surveys over decades has been astonishing. And a number of quantitative ecologists back in 2019 actually took all that data and they synthesized it, they crunched it, and they said, what's going on with birds? We need to understand. And what we know is that since 1970, we have lost almost 3 billion individual birds. Now, that doesn't mean that any species in North America have necessarily gone extinct, but we do have a number of species that have declined precipitously. That is to say, they're simply less abundant than they used to be. So, for example, there are half as many wood thrushes as there used to be. Cerulean warblers are down 70%. Evening grosbeaks, one of the favorite birds to see in Wisconsin during the winter at bird feeders, my gosh, they're down almost 90%. And the list goes on. And what we're seeing are rare species becoming rarer, and even common species like grackles, for goodness sake. Grackles have declined 40% across North America. Birds are bellwethers of ecosystem health. And when we know birds are declining, as we're seeing now, we know that the system is starting to go out of balance, and that has grave implications for us. So we're paying attention. Now, if we look at specific groups of birds associated with the large biomes in North America, eastern forests, western boreal forests, grasslands, and so on, you can see the percent decline in this graphic associated with those groups of birds. And when you get to the right side of the slide, and you can see that grassland birds have diminished 53%, oh my gosh, that is cause for alarm. In fact, we know that there used to be far more meadowlarks than there are now. We have seen a 75% decline in eastern meadowlarks. They used to be abundant. And now, when we go out and do bird surveys looking for species, it's actually a big deal to find a meadowlark. Thank goodness we're still finding them, not nearly as many as we used to. And of course, the bird that you see depicted here in the grassland bird arrow, that's trajecting, for which the trajectory is downward, is a bobolink, which is one of the favorites here in Wisconsin. And it's a species that spends the winter far, far south in South America. In fact, that bird travels about almost 6,000 miles one way when it leaves Wisconsin to breed on the grasslands or to spend the winter in the grasslands in Northeast Argentina. So it's got a long and arduous journey. And what we're seeing, in fact, are significant declines associated with groups of birds that spend the winter in Central and South America. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Closer to home, my gosh, even some of our favorite bird feeder birds are declining. We've lost 25% of our blue jays, 25% of our rose-breasted grosbeaks, 30% of our Baltimore orioles, and so on. And these are the birds that everybody loves to feed, everybody loves to see. We for many of them, herald their return either in the fall in the case of white-throated sparrows, or celebrate their return with Baltimore orioles and rose-breasted grosbeaks every spring. And again, common species becoming less common. So we've got to get a handle on this. Well, what are the big drivers then of these declines, not only of birds, but of species worldwide? And what is behind all this habitat loss? The big driver is population increase. So we have about 8 billion people in the world now, and we're going up by some 1.5 million people every week. It's really quite substantial. And you can see that our urban areas are becoming even bigger, as depicted in the slide of Mexico City. Now, this is a flyover of Mexico City, almost 600 square miles, 22 million people packed into this dense urban area. If you can imagine being a Baltimore Oriole flying out of Wisconsin, trying to get to Costa Rica, and you're flying over Mexico City and you're running out of fuel and you're pooped, you need to just sit down and take a rest for a while, you need a drink. Goodness gracious, where in Mexico City are you going to find a safe place to do that? And so what we're seeing is, as these birds are moving across continents, they're experiencing ever greater challenges as habitat diminishes and as the landscapes intrinsically become more hostile for the species that are trying to exist in them. It's not just population growth, but it's population growth that is also fueling an increase in consumption. So as we add 1.5 million people a week, those folks need to have things to eat, they need to have clothes to wear, they need to have places to live, and so on. And what we're seeing across the globe is an explosive increase in industrial agriculture that is actually driving the significant habitat losses, particularly in tropical realms, but also in the prairie pothole region of North America. Believe it or not, we're still losing native prairie, and at an accelerating clip. And so what we're seeing is this, what we need to try to do is determine how we can integrate biodiversity conservation into industrial agriculture, if in fact it's possible to do that. The jury is still very much out on that. Now, that is not to say that organic agriculture or small family farms are really major contributors to biodiversity loss. They are not. What we're most concerned about is large-scale production, where you have pristine habitats that are being converted thousands and thousands of acres of monotypic row crops with high inputs of fertilizers and high inputs of pesticides. Those are just not environments that are conducive to the continuation of nature as we know it. So species diversity then is essential to healthy ecosystems. As we're trying to build climate resistant systems, What we know is that the more species that are occurring within an ecosystem, the more resilient our climate is, excuse me, our ecosystems will be to climate change. Species diversity really underpins ecosystem health. It's those interactions between millions of species across every continent on the planet that enable our systems to provide clean water, clean air, healthy soils that translate directly to food production and so on. So this extinction crisis that we have going on is actually eroding our ability to maintain healthy ecosystems, to not only thwart climate change, but simply to support ourselves. And that's why species diversity and the extinction crisis are so very important. And it's absolutely imperative that we get a handle on it. So we are now caught between a proverbial rock and a hard place. Well, okay, so that's the sobering news. But the good news is that there is a future for nature. And that future lies, I believe, largely in the hands of birds, because birds have the ability to catalyze conservation. Almost everyone has a bird story. I can't tell you the number of people that I've talked to over the years that say, oh, our robins are having babies. Oh, we have hummingbirds coming to the feeder. And these are folks that aren't hardcore birders, as it were. They just have that innate connection to nature, something that's been called biophilia. We are hardwired to connect to and to nurture and to love nature. And birds are a great portal to enable us to do that. So this is a slide of the very first birders off to a festival. I don't know where they were headed, but you can see that the fellow from Wisconsin was in the lead. We've been a conservation leader for a very long time. Actually, rumor has it they might have been headed to St. Croix Falls. I'm not sure. Suffice it to say, birds have been part of our culture since the dawn of man, and they will continue to play an important role, and even more so as we're dealing with the twin threats of climate change and extinction. So let's take a look at what's cooking in the world of birds. The first example I want to give you, which I just love because this is so cool, is something I call the Hokotoko effect. And to provide a little bit of background, we're going to go down to the small but hyper diverse country of Ecuador. About the size of Colorado, Ecuador harbors more species than most countries on planet Earth. Just to give you a relative feel for the species diversity in Ecuador, and it's for all groups of species. This is birds, butterflies, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, plants, and so on. We have about 235 species of birds that breed in Wisconsin. Ecuador, the size of Colorado, has almost 1,700 species of birds. You can't go anywhere in Ecuador without seeing great stuff. It's a marvelous place, in addition to the incredible culture that occurs there. But it is hyper diverse biologically and critically important for the global conservation, within the global conservation arena. So there is a fellow by the name of Dr. Robert Ridgely who spent his entire life working on tropical birds. Bob is a bird polymath. I had the opportunity to bird with him a number of years ago, and he is nothing short of extraordinary. He's one of those folks that literally goes out into these very rich tropical environs and says, okay, let's see what we can find. And as he's walking through the woods, his Rolodex is spinning and he's going, that's a so-and-so and that's a so-and-so, and he's making lists. And literally every bird Bob hears, he knew. It's astonishing to be with people like that, especially those that have a command of the tropical birds, because the New World tropics are the epicenter of bird diversity on planet Earth. There simply are more species in Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Peru, and so on than anywhere else on the planet. And to have a command of those species, the ability to identify them in the field, is nothing short of staggering. Well, Bob is also a very prolific author, and he has authored the Field Guide to the Birds of Panama, a Field Guide to the Birds of Ecuador, and the Birds of South America, not only Volume 1, but as you might imagine, Volume 2 as well. Bob is simply astonishingly fluent with birds. He goes back to Ecuador every year and he helps local conservation organizations do bird surveys. And a number of years, this is actually back in in 1997, a number of years ago, Bob was walking through very diverse cloud forests in deep southern Ecuador in the Andes Mountains, where the topography is profoundly rugged and the peaks of the mountains are bathed in mist every day in clouds. They result in a vegetation type known as cloud forest or bosque neblina is what they call it in Ecuador. And Bob was going through with two colleagues from Ecuador, and they were making notes on what they were seeing and what they were hearing. And lo and behold, he heard something that he had never heard before. And he was very puzzled. And this is what he heard and was not aware of what on earth it could have been. So back in 1997, had Bob had a cell phone at that point, the cell phones weren't invented by then, but had Bob had a cell phone, he would have simply held it up and made a recording of it. Back in 1997, we were all still relying on big old Uher, U-H-E-R, a brand of German tape recorder that was built Ford tough for use in the field. They ran back to the field station, which was a few kilometers, grabbed an old Uher tape recorder, scampered back to the site they were at, and they hunkered down under these big tree ferns. They recorded the bird's call and they played it back and waited. And they waited and they waited. And within about 10 or 15 minutes, suddenly one of these came bounding out of the forest. This bird is the size of a grapefruit. It was completely undiscovered to the scientific community until Bob and his colleagues called it into view in 1997. They eventually ended up calling it the Hokotoco ant pitta. Now, so ant pittas are a group of New World, so Western Hemisphere species that are restricted to the tropics in terms of distribution. Birders like to call them because of they're terrestrial in nature, so they basically spend all their time on the forest floor. As a group, they're very secretive. They can be very difficult to find. And of course, this species eluded discovery until 1997. The Hokotoco, by the way, is the mnemonic, the verbalization of its actual call. It's hoko, toko, hoko, toko. And the locals, they found out after they started to spread the word about the discovery of this bird, said, oh, we've known about that forever. We call it the Hokotoco. So in honor of local indigenous knowledge, they said, we're going to call this the Hokotoco ant pitta. Now, at the same time that they discovered this bird, they heard chainsaws whirring in the background. And they realized immediately that if they didn't save the habitat for this newly discovered species, this grapefruit-sized beauty, that its future was going to be very short-lived because the clearing for forest the clearing for cattle expansion was moving upslope rapidly, and this bird was in the crosshairs. So they said, well, what are we going to do? Well, they put their heads together, and lo and behold, they came up with what they're calling Fundación Hokotoco in Ecuador, the Hokotoco Foundation, which is dedicated first and foremost to protecting the habitat of this bird. And they did successfully do that. They made an appeal globally. The money came pouring in, and they were able to establish a multi-thousand acre reserve that harbored what they knew at that time to be the only population for this species on planet Earth. Now, they also realized that there was much more work to do, and they thought, well, if we can do it for this bird, we can do it for other species in Ecuador. The movement grew, the organization matured, and their record of accomplishment has been nothing short of astonishing. Since its founding in 1997, the Hokotoco Foundation has created a number of reserves and protected almost now, actually, it's closer to 80 to 100,000 acres of the most biologically rich habitat on planet Earth. And it's important not only for all those resident species that occur in Ecuador, the myriad frogs, toads, butterflies, salamanders, and so on, but for many of our neotropical migrants as well. So a small list of species, a partial list of species that occur in the reserves that breed in Wisconsin include Swainson's thrushes, rose-breasted grosbeaks, Baltimore orioles, scarlet tanagers, olive-sided flycatchers, Canada warblers, cerulean warblers, and so on. Every acre that Hokutoku is protected is important not only for the resident wildlife in Ecuador, but also for all of our migratory birds. And so what we see is the discovery of the single species has resulted in this incredible protection effort and this strong and flourishing conservation movement in Northwest South America, because that success has now spilled into Colombia and south into Peru. And we see similar efforts taking place there. It's really been quite remarkable. By the way, the different colors for these little icons that you see on the map of Ecuador are simply all of their reserves. The blue colors show the, the red colors show the reserves that have lodges that you as nature lovers and conservationists can literally go visit, and the blue have sites that are accessible but that don't have lodges where you can actually stay. And I've stayed in several of their nature reserves in their lodges. Just a spectacular experience from start to finish. Now, just as Hokutoku is getting up and running and things are really looking good, lo and behold, we had the same thing happen about 2,000 miles to the southeast, down in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil, where just a few years ago in 2015, an ornithologist by the name of Rafael Bosas was working in a land type called the Cerrado. The Cerrado is a vast expanse of tropical savanna immediately south of the Amazon basin. So when we think of Brazil, we all think of the Amazon. It stands to reason. It's incredibly important for a variety of reasons. But immediately south of it, is a habitat that's even more threatened than the Amazon is because of industrial agriculture. And so there's a movement going on now within this habitat type in Brazil to catalog as much of the Cerrado as possible, to identify those areas that are the most critical for conservation and to ensure their protection. And Raphael was out surveying areas and he heard a bird he had never heard before. This is how it sounded. Now I'm going to imitate it, and it's not going to be the best rendition. I'm sure I would not be mobbed by this bird should I be in Brazil, but this will give you a feel for what he heard. It was simply a soft quack, 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 and he had never heard it. This time, the ornithologist had a cell phone, held it up, recorded it, and lo and behold, what came in but this bird, a blue-eyed ground dove, which had been thought to be extinct. In fact, it had not been sighted for 75 years. So Raphael actually rediscovered this bird. It was Hokutoku reimagined down in Brazil. There was a flurry of discussion, a lot of conservation activity as a result, which continues, by the way, to this day. And one of the first actions to come out of the discovery of this bird was the establishment of Botumirum State Park in Brazil, 88,000 acres of threatened Cerrado habitat to help this bird survive. Right out of the blocks, an 88,000 acre state park. There are also a variety of ancillary conservation activities which are taking place now, all sparked by discovery of this bird. It really is quite remarkable how people, communities, entire governments are willing to rally around the discovery of these species. And again, it's because of our biophilia and particularly our innate love for birds. There are only 15 blue-eyed ground doves left in the world. I tried to get a recording so I could embed it in the slide of the bird. And it turns out that the recording of the species, the vocalization, is actually under lock and key. And when I dug a little deeper, it made sense to me, because what would happen is biologists are good with this information, but in the world of birding, there's a spectrum that runs from really well-behaved birders to those who are not quite as well-behaved. And a lot of times birds encounter less well-behaved birders who create a great deal of disturbance. They don't want that to happen in this instance, so they literally keep the vocalizations for this species under lock and key, so people can't disturb the birds in order to see them. It's incredible. I've never seen that much security associated with the rediscovery of a bird, but it's important and it's effective. Closer to home, we have some great bird things going on. So birds are leading the charge here in Wisconsin as well. Now, a number of years ago, an organization called BirdLife International, which is based in England, created what they call the Important Bird Area System. They knew by looking at the conservation needs in Europe that they would never be able to save everything. So they said, let's determine where the most important things for bird conservation are. Those are the sites we'll designate. We'll draw a line around them. We'll call them important bird areas. We will direct attention to them. We'll build support for them, and we'll garner resources not only for their long-term protection, but for their appropriate management as well. That construct, that important bird area approach has gone global to the point where we now have, oh my gosh, more than 12,000 IBAs, important bird areas across the planet, almost 3,000 here in North America, and we have 93 important bird areas in Wisconsin. And you can see we have Wisconsin parsed out into polygons that are in green, and they cover most of the state. These are the areas. Now, these aren't the only areas that are important for bird conservation. Clearly, everywhere that has habitat is important. But if we want to be strategic and we want to make sure we invest our resources wisely, we need to focus on those areas at this point that are most critically important to provide the ability to conserve Wisconsin's birds. And so you're looking at the map. And in fact, there are organizations now that are working within these and on behalf of these important bird areas. And I'm very happy to say that one of them is Landmark. So Landmark Conservancy has taken an extremely smart approach to land protection. It's science-driven and it's very well thought out. So I just want to show you a map of Landmark's priorities. You can see outreach areas and focus areas. The various counties are in a lighter shade. And if you look at where the overlap with IBAs, important bird areas, is as it relates to Landmark's priorities, you can see that there's a high degree of overlap that spans the entire operational geography for the Conservancy. And that doesn't mean that birds are necessarily the only factor driving the consideration in terms of where the highest priorities are for Landmark to do the great work that they do. But what it means is birds factor heavily into that. And it's again reflective of the level of science and the level of thought and the level of deliberate consideration that's going into the strategies that Landmark is wisely using to protect the land that they protect. It really is an excellent strategy, benefiting not only all the native biota, but most certainly all the birds associated with those sites as well. A great example is Meridian Barrens, which was protected just a few years ago. It's a 345-acre site. And just to give you an idea, if you're not familiar with barrens, barrens are these transitory habitats that are they're not really forests because there aren't enough trees, and they're not really grasslands because there are some trees. And as a result, a lot of them have been pastured or developed or subject to agriculture, and they've just disappeared. We consider barrens to be, in general, an imperiled landscape in Wisconsin. And when we have the opportunity to protect a barrens area, is particularly at this scale, it's really, we try very hard to make that happen. And this was just a remarkable conservation coup that Landmark did back in, I believe it was about, gosh, must just been a handful of years ago when this came online. And not only is it important because of the intrinsic values of barrens, and you get lots of grasslands and barrens associated birds with these habitats, but they're great for insects and they're great for reptiles as well. Really an important acquisition. And it's not just the acquisition itself that's important, but it's a reflection where this was done, the scale at which it was done shows how very proficient Landmark is at doing meaningful conservation at scale. It's not just a matter of protecting an individual parcel. They've scaled up. They're looking at these big blocks of habitat and making them even bigger. And when we look at Wisconsin and consider the fact that 85% of Wisconsin is privately owned, we know that it's not going to be possible to protect all of it. So we have to protect those areas that are considered most critical from a conservation standpoint. This happens to be one of those areas. This is the Lower Chippewa Bottoms, which is an IBA, and it has a number of other important designations as well, all of which factor into Landmark's decision-making process as it strategically deploys resources to connect land. These big blocks of land, these anchor properties, are going to be critically important for sustaining ecosystem function long-term. So to the extent that Landmark is partnering with other organizations, including DNR and the Forest Service, to take blocks of land and make them even bigger and better for conservation, that helps ensure a future and functional ecosystems well into the future. Good for birds, good for all biota, and particularly good for people as well. So just doing terrific work. And as Sarah had mentioned earlier, oh my gosh, I believe more than 41,000 acres protected. Landmark is on fire, and hats off to all of you who are supporters. For those of you who may not have had the opportunity to support Landmark yet, I really encourage you to do so. It's vitally important. They're doing great work, and I do want to point out that every acre they're protecting, every acre protected by Landmark would probably not be protected by other organizations, simply because resources are limited, and it just wouldn't have happened with Wisconsin DNR or the Forest Service or local county governments and so on. So Landmark is occupying a critically important niche by making these incredibly important protection efforts transpire across, again, their operational geography in Northwest Wisconsin. So we have a lot of work to do, but the fact is, the hard reality is that we can stitch everything back together. We need to make a concerted effort to do so. Now, in the end, all conservation is local. And what that means is it's not enough for us simply to support Landmark. Landmark support is critical, but we all need to take responsibility for ourselves and turn our yards into little bastions of biodiversity. And when all of us do that, that's how we begin to scale up. And when we do it in concert with the lands that Landmark and DNR and Forest Service and other conservation entities are protecting, and we complement what's going on and what's being done by those organizations, now we're going to get to the point where we're going to create landscapes that are thriving. The most important thing that we can do as landowners, and this is literally the most important thing we can do, go native, plant native species. It's critically important. And birds, once again, can help illustrate a great example of that. But suffice it to say that if you take a native oak versus a native ginkgo and look at the number of Lepidoptera larvae, that is larvae of butterflies and moths that feed on oaks versus ginkgos, you can see that almost 600 species of butterflies and moths feed on oak leaves. That's white oaks, swamp white oaks, red oaks, black oaks, bur oaks, and so on. Whereas there's one species of caterpillar that has been found on a ginkgo in North America. Ginkgos are native to Southeast Asia. That's where they belong. We plant them widely here because they're a lovely tree, but they're basically biologically inert. And so every non-native species that we plant is taking up space that would otherwise be occupied by native species. And as we're planting non-native species, we're diminishing the ability of our ecosystems to function, because all of the species in them, particularly the insects and everything that depends on insects, and that, by the way, is everything, the insects simply can't find food to eat because they're not adapted to eat ginkgos. So as we convert our ornamental landscapes to native species, we create a situation that allows native insects, native reptiles, native amphibians, and particularly birds to thrive. Best example I can give you is a black-capped chickadee. So chickadees, much beloved by everybody, a wonderful little bird. They actually lay eggs. They have about 4 or 5 eggs every spring. And so that clutch of eggs hatches, and they've got 4 or 5 little hungry mouths to feed. The young spend about 2 weeks in the nest, and after they fledge, they spend about 2 weeks with mom and dad, and then they wander off on their own because they get booted, and they said, it's time for you guys to go make it on your own now. But during that 4-week period when they're dependent on their parents for food, it's been calculated that chickadees have to find, for a clutch of 4 babies, about 15,000 caterpillars during the course of 2 weeks. During that, or excuse me, course of 4 weeks, during that time, the parents are continuously foraging for food. The babies are growing rapidly. They can't find enough food in environments that are dominated by non-native species. There was a study that was done out east in suburban Virginia. And what they found is yards, suburban yards, acre, 2 acres or so, that have less than 70% native vegetation are quite simply acting as sinks for birds. What that means is the birds are coming in, they're setting up shop because they see all these trees and shrubs and go, well, this looks good. We think we can live here. They have young. And then when they start going from non-native species to non-native species, looking for caterpillars and beetles and other things to eat, they're not finding them. And so their reproductive effort is often for naught. Even in our yard in La Crosse, when my wife and I lived in La Crosse, we would have a single chickadee, and there should be 4. And we would have a single catbird that would be raised to fledging stage, and there should be 3 or 4 baby catbirds. If it was predators that took the nests out, they would eat everything, so there wouldn't be any babies at all. And what I finally concluded after learning more about the connection and understanding what was going on in our neighborhood was largely dominated by non-native species. The birds simply weren't finding enough to eat. You plant native species, the response is almost immediate, and you're going to help chickadees and other species find all that food that they need to bring off that next brood of babies and to keep those species going in your neighborhood and to a larger extent across Wisconsin and regionally. So what we want to do is we want to make our yards oases for birds simply by planting native species. It's very easy to do. The impact is almost immediate, and you will be astonished after you get something in and the plants start to mature, the response that you get from birds, butterflies, all of the native pollinators, and so on. And if we all do this, let's say everybody on a block, if you have 12 neighbors living in homes on a single block, and they all devoted a portion of the yard to going native, oh my gosh, the impact would be really significant. And you'd see great things happening in terms of nature responding. So in the end, we can let birds be our beacon of hope. Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, the late, great Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, who coined the term biodiversity, said it best when he said, if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the big problems in the world. So let's let birds be our guiding light. Let's let birds be our portal to restoring nature and to building ecosystems that will thrive and enable us to live healthy, meaningful lives well into the future. And that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks, Craig. As always, inspiring and educational. And so we host a number of events throughout the year like this one, where we seek to inspire, educate, and engage people in topics related to nature and the outdoors. And of course, we don't solely focus just on birds, but it is one of the topics that we love to incorporate into our programming. So throughout the year, we hold several opportunities, and I just want to highlight a couple of those right now. So one of them is Bird School. This year, for the first time, we decided to partner with Beaver Creek Reserve, which is a nature center east of Eau Claire, for a 2.5-day event for beginner or intermediate birders. So participants had a chance to attend. There was lots of speakers and guest experts, and they got to learn the basics from how to use binoculars to how to use field guides, the identification basics of how to bird by ear, how to bird by sight. And it really was a great 2.5 days, and we hope to do it again next year. We also host a train ride. So on the right side here, you see people standing on a trestle, and that's from our annual train ride in the Tiffany Wildlife Area in Buffalo County. And this occurs during spring migration when all the birds are migrating. And we've been very lucky to have Craig Thompson as our bird guide on this train ride each year. We already have next year booked for Saturday, May 11th. And again, we're lucky to have Craig joining us again. And then our northern staff participates in an event called the Chequamegon Bay Birding and Nature Festival. And it's a series of events that happen throughout the Ashland and Bayfield area. But our staff puts together and hosts a couple bird hikes on properties that Landmark has helped protected. And then next spring, we're excited that we're going to be, again, working with Beaver Creek Reserve to train some volunteers to collect data on bluebirds. So we're going to install some bluebird houses at our Mary Fitz Memorial Park property just south of Eau Claire, and we'll be collecting data and having those volunteers contribute that data to a database. So in addition to these events, and one of the things actually that I really love about these events is that the people that are there have this shared love of birds and of just learning. And being on the staff at Landmark Conservancy, I can tell you that our staff really enjoys spring migration, fall migration. We enjoy learning about birds as well. And we get really excited in the spring. So when the first sandhill cranes are flying overhead or we hear them, lots of times we're texting each other or excited to come into the office and share that information, or we hear a woodcock. In the fall, we see the V's of the birds migrating, signaling fall migration. And it's just part of our culture here at Landmark. And so as we continue to protect land in Northwest Wisconsin, you know, we really care deeply that our work is impactful and that we can be part of the solution. Well, I think that we will wrap it up for tonight. It is just a little bit past 6. I want to respect everybody's time, but I just want to say thank you to our presenter, Craig, for a great presentation. And thank you all for being here. And I hope that you have a lovely evening.